The First World War changed the rules of combat forever. The Russian Empire desperately sought a miracle weapon that would break the front and bring victory. Traditional infantry units died by the tens of thousands in the trenches, and artillery barrages turned battlefields into lunar landscapes. The military command was ready to consider any project that promised an advantage over the enemy. The horse, barbed wire, the machine gun, all of this ceased to be enough in a conflict that consumed human and material resources at a pace unimaginable for previous wars. In January 1915, a project that was supposed to change the course of the war landed on the desk of Emperor Nicholas II. The hitherto unknown engineer Nikolai Lebedenko appeared at an audience with an extraordinary proposal. He did not bring technical drawings or complicated calculations with him. Instead, he took a mechanical toy out of his briefcase, a miniature model of a combat machine with huge wheels and a small rear wheel supporting the structure. The Tsar, a man known for his love of all technical novelties, was fascinated. Lebedenko demonstrated the model's operation on the floor of the audience hall. He wound up the spring and released the toy, which glided confidently across the parquet. Then, the engineer began to set up obstacles: stacks of books, small boxes, folded documents. The model climbed over the improvised obstacles without problems, and its great wheels easily overcame everything that stood in its way. Nicholas II watched the demonstration with growing enthusiasm. The Emperor of Russia and the humble constructor spent the next hour literally playing with the toy on the court parquet, trying out various configurations of obstacles and checking the capabilities of the miniature tank. After the demonstration ended, the atmosphere in the hall was almost friendly. The Tsar asked questions about the technical capabilities of the full-size machine, and Lebedenko zealously presented a vision of a gigantic combat vehicle that, thanks to its cyclopean dimensions, would break the line of German trenches. The monarch's imagination was working at top speed. He already saw columns of such machines crushing barbed wire, breaking through enemy fortifications, and leading the Russian infantry straight to victory. The meeting ended with a decision that cost the state treasury a fortune. Lebedenko received official permission to build the real Tsar Tank, as well as a sum of money completely disproportionate to the engineer's achievements to date. The project was surrounded by extraordinary secrecy. To mislead potential spies, construction details were distributed among different production plants throughout the empire. Each factory received an order for specific elements, which were to be made under the guise of producing ship parts or equipment for heavy industry. The great wheels were ordered as components for industrial mills. Massive steel beams figured in documents as fragments of bridge structures. Armor plates were described as elements of destroyer hulls. This system was intended to ensure that no one outside a narrow circle of initiates would be able to piece together the true picture of what was being created. In the spring of 1915, just a few months after the audience with the Tsar, assembly of the machine began. The pace of work was dizzying, especially given the technical and logistical capabilities of the time. Imperial patronage meant unlimited access to resources, as well as priority treatment for all orders related to the project. Factories worked at top speed, and railway transports delivered finished elements to the place that was to become the arena for the birth of the most peculiar war machine in the history of humanity. The residents of the village of Orodyevo in the Dimitrov district were accustomed to a quiet life far from great politics and the turmoil of war. However, in the spring of 1915, their daily lives changed irreversibly. The forest, which began literally behind the last huts, was suddenly declared a closed zone. Overnight, armed patrols appeared, ruthlessly driving away anyone who tried to approach the trees. Kilometers of barbed wire were stretched around the forest, and signs with the warning, "Halt, I'll shoot," were nailed to the trees. No one explained to the residents what was happening, and any questions were met with a refusal to comment from the military. Of course, the ban only fueled curiosity. The bravest residents of the village, especially the youth, treated the new situation as a challenge. At night, they sneaked through poorly guarded sections of the fence, risking a bullet from the guards. What they saw in the depths of the forest exceeded their wildest imaginations. Between the pines and birches grew a steel beast of dimensions that defied belief. Locals returned to their homes pale with astonishment, telling a story that no one wanted to believe. After all, how can one believe in a machine as high as 3 stories, standing in the middle of a forest? The structure, indeed, caused dizziness. 2 gigantic wheels with a diameter of 9 meters dominated the entire build. Each wheel was made not of solid sheet steel, but of spokes, like a bicycle, only on a scale that seemed absurd. This design decision was justified by the desire to reduce the vehicle's mass, although in practice the entire machine still weighed 60 tons. These wheels were so tall that a person standing next to them felt like an ant beside a tree. The upper gun turret, placed between the wheels, rose 8 meters above the ground. One could observe the surrounding area from it like from a church tower. The body of the machine was shaped like the letter T and extended 12 meters in width. The length of the entire structure was almost 18 meters. At the back, behind the huge wheels, was a massive tail with a small supporting wheel, barely 1.5 meters in diameter, which looked downright comical compared to the front wheels. This disproportion in wheel sizes was not accidental, although, as it would later turn out, it was one of the fundamental errors of the project. The rear wheel was intended to be for steering and support, but the designers completely ignored basic principles of physics regarding weight distribution. The heart of this steel beast was 2 Maybach aircraft engines, the same ones that powered German Zeppelin airships. The irony of fate meant that the Russian tank was to be powered by a captured engine, originating from a shot-down enemy. The total power of the installation was 240 horsepower, which seemed impressive on paper. The projected maximum speed was determined to be 17 kilometers per hour on a paved road. In theory, this sounded reasonable. In practice, no one took into account that the machine would be moving not on asphalt highways, but on the sodden battlefields of the Great War. The armament of the Tsar Tank was to consist of 2 sponson cannons of caliber 76.2 millimeters, with a reserve of ammunition for 60 shots, as well as several Maxim machine guns with a reserve of 8,000 to 10,000 cartridges. Lebedenko himself initially planned only machine gun armament, but arranged so as to ensure all-around fire. The possibility of firing at the lower part of the tank was even foreseen. The crew was to number 15 people, which made the machine almost a floating fortress, only without the ability to float and with a very doubtful ability to move at all. However, a question arises that the designers apparently ignored. How was this machine supposed to reach the front? A width of 12 meters meant that the tank would not fit on most bridges of that time. The standard width of bridges in the Russian Empire rarely exceeded 8 meters, and many structures were even narrower. On some wider bridges, lanterns or other infrastructure elements were located in the middle of the roadway. Lebedenko apparently assumed that his creation would move exclusively through fields, jumping over rivers thanks to its gigantic wheels. This naivety, bordering on ignorance of basic logistical problems, reflects the character of the entire project well. Equally strange was the decision to assemble the machine in the forest, and not at a factory. The normal process assumes that a prototype is created in a production facility, where engineers, tools, measuring devices, and the possibility of immediate correction are available. That is also where the first driving tests are carried out. If something breaks, if something requires corrections, the team has the conditions to work. Only a verified design is taken to a polygon for combat tests, but not in the case of the Tsar Tank. Finished elements were transported by rail to Dmitrov, and from there, via a specially built narrow-gauge railway, transported to the assembly site in the forest. For a single, solitary machine, an entire polygon was created, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by armed soldiers. Building infrastructure in the middle of the forest was a logistical nightmare. It was necessary to erect roads, barracks for workers, warehouses for tools and equipment, bring in fuel, and create field workshops. All this for a machine that no one had yet seen in motion. The official explanation spoke of the need to maintain secrecy. But wouldn't it have been more logical to hide the project in a closed factory hall than in an open forest where any curious peasant could sneak in and see the steel monster? This decision arouses the astonishment of military technology historians to this day. The 27th of August, 1915, was supposed to be a day of triumph for Russian engineering thought. Representatives of the Military Commission, officers of the General Staff, and Lebedenko himself, who looked like a man convinced that he would enter history in a moment, arrived at the forest polygon. The atmosphere was tense. Mechanics bustled around the machine, checking all connections and mechanisms once again. The fuel tanks were full, the Maybach engines prepared for starting. The moment of truth had arrived for a project that had consumed a fortune and months of intensive work by hundreds of people. When the engines began to work, the sound was deafening. 2 aircraft motors tore through the air, and their vibrations were transferred to the entire steel structure. Lebedenko gave the signal to start movement. The great wheels slowly began to turn, spokes flashing in the sun. The tank shuddered and moved forward. The first obstacle was a young birch growing right by the starting place. One of the 9-meter wheels drove over the tree, snapping it like a matchstick. The commission noted a success. The machine can destroy obstacles. That was the first and last real success of the day. Next, the tank entered a specially prepared track made of wooden logs, a so-called corduroy road. This type of construction had served for centuries to cross swampy terrain. Beams were laid side by side, creating a hard surface. The Tsar Tank moved on the corduroy road confidently, though very slowly. The great wheels held firmly to the wooden beams, the engines worked stably, everything looked promising. Lebedenko smiled. Members of the commission exchanged satisfied glances. The machine was actually moving. Maybe this insane project made sense after all. But the corduroy road ended. Before the tank stretched natural forest soil, damp, swampy in places typical for this part of Russia. Exactly the kind that dominated on most fronts of the Great War. If the machine was to have any combat application, it had to cope with precisely such terrain. The great wheels stepped off the wooden beams and sank into the soft earth. At first, only a little, perhaps 50 centimeters. The tank was still moving forward, though clearly slower than on the logs. Every meter cost more and more effort. The engines howled at higher revolutions, the wheels turned, but the machine was slowing down. Then came the moment that canceled the entire project. The rear part of the structure, with the small 1.5-meter wheel, began to sink into the ground. It was exactly there that the weight of 40 tons out of the machine's total mass of 60 tons was located. The weight distribution was catastrophically incorrect. The designers placed the majority of the weight in the tail of the tank and not over the large load-bearing wheels. It was an error worthy of a technical school student, and not an engineer working on a project for imperial money. The small rear wheel had no chance of supporting such a load on soft ground. The wheel submerged deeper and deeper, until finally the entire rear part of the machine settled in the mud. The front, gigantic wheels hung practically in the air, barely touching the surface of the earth. The driver added gas, the engines howled like madmen, the great wheels spun faster and faster, but the Tsar Tank stood in place. What is more, the wheels spinning in neutral only deepened the trenches beneath them, losing contact with the ground more and more. It was a sight simultaneously spectacular and pathetic. A steel giant that was supposed to break enemy lines was helplessly stuck in the mud after just a few dozen meters of driving off the paved track. Lebedenko issued feverish commands. Various maneuvers were attempted. Reversing, impossible. The rear wheel had drowned too deep. Increasing engine power. This only caused the front wheels to dig into the earth even more. Mechanics tried to place planks, branches, anything that could increase traction under the wheels. Nothing helped. After several hours of fruitless attempts, it became clear that the Tsar Tank had been defeated by ordinary wet earth. Not by enemy trenches, not by fortifications, not by opponent artillery. By mud. The military commission did not leave a dry thread on the project. The protocol from the trials sounded devastating. Machine unfit for movement on average terrain. And yet the war was being fought on precisely such terrains. Sodden fields, forests, swamps, roads turned into mud by rain, and thousands of boots. There was no talk of perfectly paved highways along which the Tsar Tank could march to the enemy. The whole idea was based on the assumption that the battlefield would resemble a palace courtyard, where the miniature model rolled before the delighted Tsar. Shelling tests were also conducted, which revealed another fundamental design flaw. The great wheels with spokes, which were supposed to reduce the mass of the machine, turned out to be lethally vulnerable to shelling. When a high-explosive shell hit the center of one of the wheels, the explosion tore the spokes like threads. The steel structure, which was supposed to withstand enemy fire, folded like a house of cards. One hit was enough to immobilize the tank, and on a real battlefield, artillery shelling was ceaseless. The Tsar Tank would not have survived even the first hour of combat. The question remained: how to evacuate a 60-ton machine buried in the forest soil. The answer was no way. There was no equipment capable of pulling such a large and heavy object out of the mud. Several dozen horses could have been brought in, but even they would not have managed to move the machine stuck so deep. The use of other mechanical vehicles? In the year 1915, there were practically none in Russia, and existing ones were too weak. The Tsar Tank remained exactly where it got stuck during the first trials. Lebedenko tried to convince the commission that it was enough to improve the weight distribution, reinforce the rear part, perhaps add one more wheel. But the war was consuming resources at a pace no one had experienced before. The front ate people, ammunition, weapons, food. Every ruble counted, and the project, which had already consumed a fortune, showed only one thing. It was capable of getting stuck in the first swamp it found. The decision was unavoidable. The project was closed. No further work, no improvements, no subsequent trials. Lebedenko's Tsar Tank officially became the most expensive failure of Russian military thought. The official verdict of the military commission sounded brutal. Lebedenko's Tsar Tank is completely unsuitable for use on uneven terrain. For a project that was supposed to break enemy defensive lines on the sodden fronts of the Great War, such an assessment was a death sentence. The document contained a detailed justification in which every technical absurdity of this design was listed. The commission drew attention to the catastrophic weight distribution, inadequate rear wheel, lack of ability to maneuver on difficult terrain, and complete inability to overcome even small obstacles outside a paved surface. The military also conducted a series of shelling tests, which definitively buried hopes of saving the project. Military theorists predicted problems at first glance, but practical demonstrations exceeded the worst expectations. When an artillery shell exploded near one of the gigantic wheels, the shock wave tore the delicate spokes like paper. The entire wheel deformed, and part of the spokes simply fell off. The steel giant tilted to the side. The entire structure began to bend under its own weight. The machine literally folded like a cardboard model. The second test was even more devastating. A direct hit on the center of the wheel caused that entire artful openwork structure to fly apart into pieces. Fragments of steel spokes shot out for several dozen meters. If a crew had been inside, shrapnel from their own machine would have killed them more effectively than the enemy. It was unimaginable, a combat vehicle that poses a greater threat to its own operators than to the opponent. On a real battlefield, where artillery grenades fell by the dozens per minute, the Tsar Tank would not have survived even a quarter of an hour. Lebedenko desperately tried to defend his work. He proposed replacing the spoked wheels with solid steel discs, but that would mean increasing the mass by further tons, which would only deepen the problem with weight distribution and mobility. He suggested reinforcing the rear part, adding additional supporting wheels, changing the geometry of the entire structure. Every proposal required practically rebuilding the entire machine from scratch, and that, in turn, meant further months of work and further fortunes from the imperial treasury. The problem lay in the fact that Russia no longer had all of this. The year 1915 brought a series of crushing defeats on the fronts. The army of the Tsarist Empire lost thousands of soldiers every week. There was a lack of rifles, ammunition, uniforms, food, medicines. The front consumed everything, and there was still too little of it. In such a situation, the idea to further finance a project that could not travel even 100 meters on muddy ground was simply absurd. Every ruble spent on the Tsar Tank was a ruble taken from the real needs of the army. The decision was made to close the project. No further work, no financing, no attempts to save the concept. Lebedenko was deprived of access to funds and sent away empty-handed. His dream of entering history as the creator of a miracle weapon came true, but in the worst possible way. he entered history as the author of one of the most spectacular engineering failures. The steel giant remained where it got stuck during the first trials. The forest around the polygon was still a closed zone, but no longer due to the secrecy of the project, but out of pure embarrassment. No one knew what to do with the 60-ton structure stuck in the forest soil. Ideas varied. Someone suggested blowing the machine up so as not to leave evidence of the catastrophic mistake. Others proposed dismantling it on the spot and taking the pieces away. But the war devoured every free pair of hands and every free transport vehicle. No one had time or means to deal with scrap metal in the middle of the forest. The Tsar Tank simply stayed. Then came the year 1917. The February Revolution overthrew Tsar Nicholas II, the same one who played with Lebedenko's wind-up toy with childlike enthusiasm. The Russian Empire began to disintegrate at a rapid pace. The army lost discipline, soldiers deserted en masse, the front was crumbling. In October, the Bolsheviks took power in Petrograd. A civil war began, which consumed further millions of lives. In this chaos, in this ocean of blood and suffering, no one thought about any tank stuck in the forest near Dmitrov. The Tsar Tank stood. The guard had, of course, been withdrawn long ago. The barbed wire disappeared in places, stolen by local residents for various needs. The forest slowly began to reclaim what man had taken from it. Vines climbed the steel structures, moss-covered places where paint and rust gave way to nature. The great wheels, which were supposed to crush the enemy, slowly sank deeper and deeper into the earth. Time did its work. Connections corroded, elements loosened, rain and snow penetrated into the interior of the machine. The residents of Orudyevo got used to the presence of the steel monster. Children who remembered the first appearance of the machine grew up themselves and had their own children. The new generation treated the Tsar Tank as part of the landscape, something as natural as an old mill or a destroyed bridge. Locals began to call this fragment of the wilderness the Tank Forest. The name stuck so strongly that even decades later, old men showed the younger ones. There, where the Tank Forest is, one must turn right to the mill. The new Soviet power did not know about the existence of this structure at all for a long time. The Bolsheviks had much more serious problems: consolidation of power, the fight against white armies, famine, economic ruin. Some rusty tank in the forest was the last thing that interested them. Only when the situation in the country began to stabilize did someone in the local authorities remember the metal giant stuck several kilometers from the village. In the year 1923, someone in Moscow cabinets made a decision. It is time to deal with this embarrassing relic of the Tsarist era. The country needed metal. Industry was slowly rebuilding. Every ton of steel was worth its weight in gold. And here in the forest stood 60 tons of excellent raw material, waiting only for dismantling. An order was issued. Dismantle Lebedenko's Tsar Tank and melt it down into something useful. The team of workers that arrived at the tank forest in the spring of the year 1923 faced a task as absurd as the creation of this machine itself. It was necessary to cut into pieces a structure that had not even managed to move from its spot during trials. The irony was painful. The machine, which 8 years earlier had been assembled in this forest with great effort and for imperial money, now had to be cut into scrap with acetylene torches. That which was supposed to be a symbol of the power of Russian engineering ended as steel for reprocessing. The dismantling process lasted for weeks. The steel elements, which had survived 8 years in the damp forest, were covered with a thick layer of rust. The great wheels with spokes, which were supposed to crush the enemy, now had to be cut fragment by fragment. The workers first dismantled the lighter parts, gun turrets, platforms, elements of equipment. Then came the time for the massive beams connecting the wheels to the body. These open-work structures, designed with the thought of reducing mass, now turned out to be a curse. Every connection required a separate cut. Every riveted part had to be forced open or broken. The wheels themselves presented the greatest challenge. 9 meters in diameter, dozens of spokes, steel rims, all this had to be somehow taken apart and hauled away. There were no cranes, there were no heavy vehicles. Everything happened by the strength of human muscles, simple tools, and primitive levers. Pieces of steel were dragged through the forest to the nearest road, and from there transported by horse-drawn carts to a scrap collection point. This process lasted months. The forest slowly regained its nature. Steel elements disappeared, and only trenches and beaten paths from dragging heavy fragments remained. Local residents watched this process with mixed feelings. On one hand, it was the end of a certain era, the end of a legend that had circulated in the area for years. On the other hand, the sight of workers laboriously cutting up rusty scrap only confirmed what everyone had known for a long time. This entire machine was a gigantic waste. 60 tons of steel, hundreds of man-hours, a fortune spent from the imperial treasury, all this for a machine that traveled maybe 30 meters before it got stuck irretrievably. When the last fragment of the Tsar Tank left the forest, only deep ruts in the earth and memories remained. The metal was melted down, most likely turned into railway rails, building structures, or whatever served the reconstruction of Soviet industry. The steel that was supposed to form an invincible weapon ended as anonymous raw material without history and without glory. That was the definitive end of Nikolai Lebedenko's project. The figure of the constructor himself remained in history as an example of how detached from reality an idea can be. Lebedenko was not a fool. He was able to build a working model. He was able to convince the Tsar of his vision. He was able to organize the production and assembly of a gigantic machine. But he committed a fundamental error that canceled everything. He did not test his concept on an intermediate scale. From a miniature toy, he jumped straight to a 60-ton monster. Every reasonable engineer would have first built a model on a scale of 1 to 10, then 1 to 5, would have checked the weight distribution, mechanics, efficiency of the wheels. Only later, having certainty that the concept works, would he have proceeded to build the full-size machine. Lebedenko did not do this. Either he was so sure of his genius that he deemed intermediate tests unnecessary, or he knew that if he built a smaller prototype and it got stuck, the Tsar would not give him money for the large one. So he risked everything on one card. He built the giant straight away and prayed for it to work. It did not work, and with that, Lebedenko went down in history not as the creator of a revolutionary weapon, but as the author of one of the most spectacular engineering fiascos. The question of possible sabotage is also interesting. Even then, in the 1920s, conspiracy theories appeared that the entire project was inspired by British intelligence. According to this version, Albion, a formal ally of Russia in the Great War, wanted to weaken the Tsarist Empire by slipping it absurd military projects that consumed resources, but gave no advantage. The Tsar Tank fit this scenario ideally. It cost a fortune, occupied hundreds of people, and its only achievement was getting stuck in the mud. Does this theory have any basis? Most likely not. But its existence shows well how grotesque Lebedenko's project was. It was so absurd that people preferred to believe in an international conspiracy than in ordinary human stupidity and lack of competence. The truth is simpler and more mundane. The Tsar Tank was the product of several factors. The desperation of the Russian command seeking a miracle weapon, the naivety of the Tsar who believed in a toy, and the arrogance of the constructor who did not want to or could not test his idea before full realization. To all of this was added the atmosphere of the Great War, when rational thinking gave way to panic and readiness to try everything just to stop the enemy. The dimensions of the Tsar Tank make an impression to this day. A height of 9 meters at the highest point is indeed 4 T-34 tanks placed one on top of the other. A width of 12 meters means that 3 tanks placed side by side would fit there. It was the largest combat wheeled vehicle ever built in metal and tested. Other projects from the era of the Great War proposed machines even larger. There were concepts of vehicles hundreds of meters long, moving on tracks or wheels 15 meters high. But all of them remained only on paper, as drawings and dreams of mad constructors. The Tsar Tank was real. It stood in the Russian forest for 7 or 8 years, a rusty monument to human pride and engineering stupidity. Its existence proves that even the most absurd ideas can be realized if only someone is found ready to finance them. And its fate, dismantling for scrap, shows what happens to projects that ignore basic laws of physics and common sense. That was the end of an era in which it was enough to show the Tsar a toy to get a fortune to build the steel monster. If you like this story about the most absurd war machine in history, leave a thumbs up. Write in the comments if you had heard about the Tsar Tank before and what you think about this project. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future tales about technology that should never have been born.